I'm not going to introduce Saeed Mirza, obviously. He requires no introduction. But maybe it's been a while since you saw his film, so maybe there may be some people here who are enviably young and have not seen the films. But for a lot of us, the idea of talking about the city of Bombay or talking about the city in our work, cinema or otherwise, is now not an uncommon. It's something that's almost it's achieved industry status actually. So it's kind of a shock to look at science films today and see that working in the 80s is kind of like laid out the template for everything that we are doing in the way that we talk about the city, in the reasons that some of us began to talk about the city in our work to try to differentiate ourselves from this kind of pan-national grand narrative of politics and the masculinist narrative of politics, but to look at the local, to look at the texture of life around us, and to create stories and political ideas from that sort of work. So you're looking at all those films, Albert Pinto Gusta Kyuanda, Salim Lambe Matro, you realize that all of those things were already done in those films, and we need not have wasted our time thinking that we were coming up with it. Those of us who thought it. I'm just going to start as a kind of refresher thing with showing you a little bit of the opening credits of two of the films, because one of the things that I noticed in the films that each film begins with a credit sequence, which is a sequence about the city. I mean, it's just a kind of montage of the city in some ways. And I showed from two films, the first one being Albert Pinto Gustaki Wanta. It's a very interesting journey to the city because it's a reverse journey, away from the kind of iconic Bombay or South Bombay towards the suburbs. And this, I mean, sequence is very different because it's like. Okay, I need some help here, technical. When we watch the sequences, one of the things that I guess we notice, and through the films, it's not as if you're like abandoning all the things that we're also seeing in Bollywood cinema, we're seeing some of the same sort of visual tropes like Marine Drive or being out in the night in the city, but you're obviously doing it very differently. And I'm wondering what were the kind of ideas of Bombay as well as the ideas of Bombay in the movies that you were working against or from? What sort of traditions were you working off?
No, because there are tales between the three films. One is Albert Pinto of Kobosaki, and then you have Saeed Akhtar. And both the films are different parts of the city. Both the films deal with different parts of the city. Salim Nalvika Matru it deals with an area which is the Crawford Market, Dongri, Nagpada, the docks behind. And Albert Pinto is much more across the board. The city in general, and specifically the area which is the middle, Lower Parel and Albag and that belt of the city. So therefore there is a difference between the two in terms of what I get out of the city. But the title sequence of say Salim Namrita Matros, it is to realize, which I use much later after the titles are over, I use it much later because it is to realize that when you have ghettoized minds and ghettoized spaces in the city, which is like Dongri and Nagpara and Namadali Road and those spaces, the release is always found at the sea, but they only come to that space in the night. They wouldn't dare come at other times. This is a kind of a cultural divide in the city. And talking about the works of, say, Sudhir Patwardhan, we don't seem to realize that the railway tracks divide the city in two separate zones. Nobody seems to understand what's across the lines on the eastern part of the city. And in fact, Salim Namrega Matru is the eastern part of the city, but the southern eastern part of the city. Whereas Albert Pinto crosses that border, it's on this side. So therefore, the way I see a city really is how it plays its role out. People's spaces, environment, on the mindset, I think, of its citizens. And most of them have really dealt with that. You had another thing of Mohan Joshi. Was it there?
I didn't show it.
Oh, you didn't? No, it was another aspect where I talked about another aspect of say Sudhir's work where he talked about, and perhaps even the works of say Dilip Chitra, he talks about the chore, the idea of the chore, and the disappearance that's going to occur. And if you realize that the entire belt from Parel to Lalbagh and Dadar, you had at one side you had the mills and then you had the mill workers who actually lived in chores, and that disappearance of that's going to occur over time. So in that sense, each film of mine is one aspect of the city really. That's really it. I've got nothing more to add.
But what's actually so interesting to see in the films is like you're almost sculpting a story out of a neighborhood because you go into a certain space and it's as if the space gives rise to a story that you're telling.
Right.
So what was the process by which you wrote these stories? How would you inhabit those spaces? Do your research and think of what sort of story occurs in this particular space?
I'll tell you the story of say how did a film like Salim Nambi Matru come to my mind. I was shooting Mohan Joshi Aziro, and I was in a jail at Dotangi. It's a very rough neighborhood. In fact, the early gang wars of Dawood Ibrahim and those Pathan gangs were right there while I was shooting the film. It was on the war. But I was taking a shot and I had a shot of Mr. Gisham Sani walking down in the morning to go to a milk booth to collect his milk. And it was a very elaborate shot and planned the whole thing out of who would cross the frame, where, and the jaw people, how would they enter the frame and exit the frame. The whole thing was set up. And I said, sound go. And as soon as I was about to say camera, there was some kind of a commotion at the end of the jaw. And they said, cut, 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 cut. And a young man walked from the gateway of the chole. It's a long chole, and he walked down that thing as if he owned the chole. And I had planted people at the gate to stop any kind of intrusion so that I could take my shot. They were obviously pushed aside. But this young man who just walked through. And I noticed his strut. It wasn't a walk, it was a strut. And I shouted, I said, "Who is this guy? Why is he there in the frame?" And then I was nudged. The chap next to me said, "Saeed, just keep quiet, let him come and let him go." And I said, "Fine, I'll keep quiet." And he paid his salams to everybody, made sure that everybody noticed him, realized that he disrupted the entire shooting, and he started out. And then I asked, I said, who's this guy? He said, he's a hitman for the gang. His name is Shiva. But that walk got me. In this chole, in Dongri, on the borders of Nagpada, that kid walked. Now, if I need to go into a certain kind of sociology and history, he doesn't know he's on a dead-end street. He doesn't know that the city denies his existence. The municipality stops at Baikala and then continues after Crawford Market. It denies that existence over there. It looks the other way. But in that space, Shiva is king. And that walk and that space in which you see ghettoized communities, ghettoized minds, anger, frustration, all occurring simultaneously, and you see the architecture, it's decaying, it's corroding in front of your eyes, and there's filth and there's garbage and nobody's around. And still is today. Nobody seems to notice that, but still is today. You realize the anger, you realize the pain, and then you make the film, Ghoda, just on that walk, and that space, and the environment, and all that's happening out there. And you make a film, Ghoda,
Actually, what is also, I'm thinking of the fact that you sit down to write certain types of films or make certain types of films in a context where other things are being said and done. There's a conscious decision to make films about this city, a very specific city. What did that arise from? Did you is it not, it can be a completely spontaneous thing on the stories you know I want to tell, but there seems to be in the films a decision that I will tell stories about this place in a particular way.
But I was born here. And despite the fact that I went to elite schools and colleges, I don't think I spent a lot of my time. Excuse me. Riding on the streets, it gave me an incredible pleasure and an incredible kind of freedom. And I spent a lot of time there. And I think I've also learned a lot from that experience over time. And the hundreds of people that I've met, the first one that we saw on the booths that made up Kharadanda and over there, I've actually drunk that stuff from that over there, So the point is that I've been through the city and I've seen exactly those tires and those Versova boats and the boats that come to the Valli sea face, the one that end up at Napian Sea Road, and how gold and diamonds and how you've actually seen with prohibition, how you saw the first time that the gangs started getting organized, as opposed to just random gundagari, but you can actually see with prohibition of gangs really getting organized. And then when you have the mill strikes, then you realize how those same gangs, in fact, it's in Albert Pinto, the same gangs are employed to disrupt and destroy a union strike, which is mentioned in the film, in the first film that we saw. It's also, the fact that I walked away from the city in the last 15 years is also true, but it is still my city, and I lived all my life here. But I feel that I don't know, it's given me so much in terms of experiences of when you meet people. I mean, I still remember that when my Albert Pinto actually preempted the textile strike. The strike occurred 2 years later. But the time that I spent in those beds and talking to those people, and the kind of anger and the kind of frustration and their dreams of what they wanted from life, nobody can take that away from you. It's part of you now. You make films of what you've been through. Now, coming back with another set of narratives, which is lots of narratives, not one, and which go into each other and move away. And, it's a celebration of a lot of things, and also perhaps tinged with a certain kind of despair. But yeah, I'm coming back with the film that I just made. In fact, it's called Eight Chance, and it's lots of narratives in it. And,
one of the interesting things that you're making stories about things that are happening around you, and in that sense, foretelling what's going to happen in the city. But there's also like a deep relationship, not just with other cinemas, but also the documentary cinema that's happening at that time, because documentary films are used in your films frequently. Like in Albert Pinto, they watch a documentary at the end of the film, and then in Saeed Akhtar Mirza, a documentary filmmaker who suspiciously like Anand Patwardhan comes to show a film about the Bhiwandi riots. But what was this relationship between documentary cinema and this desire to have a real texture and chronicle what's going on simultaneously?
Because I've always felt that you can mix up forms, you can mix up all kinds of forms with film. I don't know why it's not really done. In fact, if you see the structure of, say, a film like Mohan Joshi Hazaro, it is documentary, it is fiction, it is tamasha. It's all mixed into one as a form. And it was an attempt that I made primarily because I just felt that if you have just a narrative, it is restricting, and I think it gives you, it sort of straitjackets you with, if you want to break free of it and to say other things simultaneously. So these mixing of form that I attempted in say Mohan Joshi Hazar was to liberate myself from just the linear, So to use documentary, to use theatre, and the documentary has been employed. Even if I use a straight documentary as part of say the narrative, even the approach to shooting was very documentary in terms of style, in terms of form.
It actually makes it fantastic because you see then the texture of the films is not like anything we ever get to see anymore, even in so-called realistic films, for example. Another thing that I found, one of the things that I liked the most about the films, as opposed to the films of a similar type that say Ram Gopal Verma was making, is that I feel the female viewer is not actually unaddressed in the film. So that even if you're watching a masculine character like Sunny Nalvekamatro with masculine angst of a certain kind, but you empathize very deeply, irrespective of your gender, and you even want to be kind of cool the way the characters are cool. Like I kind of wanted to be like Salim, because he's very cool. When I didn't really want to be like Amir Khan or any of the other characters, or Manoj Bajpayee or whatever. I didn't, as a female viewer, felt pretty excluded from that. That was great. I also was very struck by the fact that you continuously bring in the presence of the Bombay mainstream cinema and how it sort of is the emotional landscape that people inhabit. I want to show a clip that I think is like a fantastic bringing together of the idea of the city and the cinema of the city in one place, in one scene.
बम्बई तो ये बोलेगा तो टॉप क्या मजा आता है यहाँ पर हाँ यार बोलेगा तो एकदम ठंडी हवा और ये सारी चिकनी चिकनी पपड़ी क्या वो जाने की बात वो दूसरी तो स्कूल का एकदम गया हाँ दूसरी शॉप कब गया उसके बाद तेरे स्कूल में तो बंद तू भी अरे मैं तो सीधा कॉलेज जा रहा होता था लो स्कूल का धंधा यार कॉलेज में कैसा छोकरा छोकरी लोग हाथ में हाथ डाल के मस्ती करता है एकदम वैसा हाउ यू आर एक मिनट आप हाय यार ए बोल ले coming for film no hey coming for discourse no hey coming for videos no hey coming for artillery yes yes फिर मैं अगर कोई धंधा चालू किया क्या नहीं सिर्फ धंधा कोई भी धंधा चोरी चपाटी नहीं हाय को मैं थक गया सबसे अब तुम लोग क्या करोगे मैं क्या करना तुम लोगों के सिवा अपन का है कौन मगर सलीम आप छूटने की बात क्यों करते हैं अनीस का शादी में बच्चे हैं बस उनको एक अच्छा मामू मिलना मांगता है ना सब कुछ देना मैं उनको सब कुछ स्कूल भेजेंगे मैं इनको कॉलेज भेजेंगे मैं इनको आइडिया टॉप है बोलेगा तो उन सबको भी एकदम बड़ा आदमी बना देगा इस एरिया में रहने वाला हाँ पता लगेगा सारी दुनिया को जीते हैं शान से हम किसी से कम नहीं बरोबर बोला एकदम बरोबर अपनी आवाज करके बोल जीते हैं शान से हम किसी से कम नहीं जीते हैं शान से हम किसी से कम नहीं
When you look back, be like that. Anyway, no, the point is that there is, when you use cinematic language, cinematic dialogue, which is popular, it has really impinged, it has entered your life, but when you put it in a context, and then you realize the entire tragedy of it all, when you realize that, sociologically it's incredibly tragic. What the hell does it mean? They are dead streets, They're not dying. And it worries me. It worries me because here you have this great dream and this great utopia, I don't know what, celebrating what. And you've got these lives which are the street level, which have sort of been accepted, embraced these words, which really mean nothing. And in that celebration of what? It is a dichotomy and a bad side. To me, it's an incredible tragedy that's actually occurring.
But at a cinematic level, it's as if you cancel out that. Well, you don't cancel out the tragedy, but you slightly mitigate that tragedy by creating a retelling of that space.
Retelling the sense of where it's done. It's something you said. It's reached. You take a clip there and then you can stay right here. But like I said, these are the tragedies of my city. And the stories, and yet there is hope. I don't know. Yet there is the battles that have been fought at every level. It's frightening.
I mean, there's too many questions to ask, and we don't have a lot of time. But like another thing that's fabulous about the films is the love stories inside the films. That the romantic narratives always again are about the space. the lack of space, the finding of space, the creating of privacy in public spaces, as Mr.
Well, that
Bhavan
scene
spoke
between
about.
him and
Mumtaz.
Mumtaz.
Are there any questions? Do people want to ask questions? I'm sure they do. Well, I'm wondering what you think about the kinds of films that have happened later, the Satyans and all the Ram Gopal Verma kind of retelling of your Salim Lambe type of story. How do you see that kind of cinema and its relationship with the city?
You know, I'd written a script. It was called To Picking On. It is after Saeed Akhtar Mirza. And a lot of people worked with me on that script. And then I rejected it because it had incredible amount of violence. And I was tired of violence. Personally, I just didn't want to, even if I might not condone it in the film, but the point is I need to show it, made me feel physically ill. It was that kind of violence. And then surprisingly, I found out that the script arrived in the office of Mr. What's his name, Ram Gopal Verma, and minor variation, and you had a Satya being made. But the point is that I'd walked away. I'd walked away from that. I just could not contain it in a sense. And then if I put it on screen, I didn't know how to contain that violence which could go berserk. It could actually terrorize an audience. And it's possible. It's actually possible. Nobody seems to realize that the actual start playing game with an audience this way can have terrifying consequences. And that's the reason I rejected it, spoke to me. But no, when I see this work, I think it's, you know, you have an attempt at giving it a kind of a historical stroke, sociological slant. There are always in the scripts now that you see, there are attempts at doing that. But somehow I just feel that they are more as they're more as they're not taken very seriously, those inputs that go into these narratives. And I'll give you an example that when I was scripting Salim Lambe, I spent a year and a half in the streets, and I used to go every night from my house. I'd leave my house at about 10 in the night, and I'd get back at 5 in the morning, and I'd record and meet and chit chat and just keep that research material with me so that it helps us. Even language is so critically important as to where how to build itself out, and all that goes into your film, and it's not a hard work, but I think that what I find out when you go into these genres now, very lot of shortcuts have been taken. There's a lot of shortcuts rather than, and the pretense of research. There's a kind of pretense of research rather than the actual.
But it seems many of these concerns, formal concerns especially, have actually moved into the documentary space. And what we find is that documentary filmmakers, especially working on the city, look continuously for mixed formats because somehow the truths and realities of the city can't be represented by single linear tales. And that interest in research and texture and language seems to have gone into that space, whereas there's a kind of simplified form of these words that are now available in fiction.
Simplified.
So, but hopefully your film will be out soon, your new film. And
no, it's absolutely different from whatever I've done. It was just a release, just to feel that I was coming back. Then you make a film which is a little more celebratory, and hopefully it's just about ready. I don't know when it will be released. All they said IPL is. I said, for God's sake, how does IPL include in my film? If I can bring on this big film, let it be released. But now they say, since the IPL is over, now these big films are coming in, so we perhaps put your film for a little later date. I said, well, these are stories one hears about, for God's sake, release the film.
Well, soon we hope. And I mean, I think people should really try to watch these films again, show them again, because I mean, they obviously have deep relevance for the work that all of us are doing right now. So thank you very much. Thanks to my host. Thanks to